The universe had seen warships before. Apocalypse fielded armadas that blotted out stars. The Reach had deployed Beetle-class destroyers across 600 worlds. The Thanagarians had once cast a shadow over an entire hemisphere of Earth with a single wing formation. The Green Lantern Corps had logged every registered weapons platform, every warp-capable hull, every engine signature from here to the edge of the source wall. They had seen warships. They had never seen anything like this. It dropped out of warp at the edge of Sector 2814, approximately 40,000 kilometers from the outer monitoring buoys of OA. And for exactly 3 seconds, every ring in that sector went silent. Not jammed, not blocked, silent. The way a room goes silent when something walks in that has no business being alive. The wave motion wake preceded the hull by nearly 2 seconds. A resonance frequency that had no entry in any known database. An energy signature that the emotional spectrum processed not as a weapon, not as a drive system, but as something rawer and older than either. The rings flickered. Constructs dissolved. 3 lanterns in adjacent patrol routes grabbed their chests as though something had reached through their rings and plucked at the willpower behind them. Then the ship emerged, and it was already dying. She was roughly 260 meters of gray steel and impossible defiance. Her line something between a naval vessel and a cathedral built by people who refused to accept that the ocean had a bottom. The main cannon, a bore that ran nearly the full length of her keel, was cold, its aperture sealed. But even inert, it radiated something that made own instruments argue with themselves. Her hull was fractured along the port quarter, an interior fire visible through a rupture near the 3rd deck. One of her secondary turrets rotated slowly, tracking nothing, its servo motors grinding in vacuum. She was listing 3 degrees to starboard, her running lights flickering in an irregular pattern that looked less like electrical damage and more like exhaustion, as though the ship itself was struggling to stay conscious. Her flag still flew. Not a broadcast, not a signal, a physical flag. Mounted at her stern, snapping in solar wind, it had no right to feel in hard vacuum. The red circle on white field of a nation that had died and been reborn and sent this ship to the edge of oblivion more times than history had the decency to count. In the OWN monitoring center, a guardian named Said stared at the readings for 11 seconds before speaking. Origin sector unknown, she said. Drive system unknown. Weapon signature, she paused. The instruments updated. Weapon signature is requesting a new classification category. Hal Jordan was already suiting up. He punched through the void at 200 kilometers per second and came alongside the Yamato's bridge tower in under 40 seconds. His ring scanning continuously, feeding him data he didn't entirely understand and some he wished he didn't. The wave motion, residue clinging to the hull wasn't radiation in any conventional sense. It was more like the ship had passed through something that physics used to be before someone decided to formalize the rules. His ring translated the crew's distress signals with a half-second lag, the language unfamiliar enough that the translation matrix was essentially improvising. Unidentified vessel, he broadcast on all frequencies, pulling up alongside the forward observation deck. This is Green Lantern Hal Jordan. Sector 2814. You have entered controlled space in proximity to OA. Please identify yourself and state your destination. Through the observation glass, he could see them. Humans, undeniably human. Young and old and exhausted in the specific way that people look when they have been fighting for long enough that survival itself has become a kind of grief. A young man with dark hair and command insignia stood at the central station. One hand braced against the console to keep himself upright. Blood dried above his left eyebrow. He looked at Hal Jordan glowing green against the stars and did not flinch. He reached for the communications panel. This is Captain Susumu Kodai of the space battleship Yamato. The translation came through, rough at the edges but clear in its intention. Vessel of Earth. We do not know where we are. We were a pause. A breath that cost him something. We were in the middle of a battle. We are damaged. We have wounded. We have dead. Another pause, shorter, harder. We are not surrendering. Hal Jordan had met Kryptonians, Thanagarians, new gods, an sentient planet that communicated. exclusively through gravitational anomalies. He had a reasonably calibrated sense of when someone was dangerous and when someone was telling the truth. Kodai was both. Copy that, Yamato, Hal said. Nobody's asking you to surrender, but I need you to hold your current position and not. And I want to be really clear here. Do not charge that main gun. Not even a warm-up cycle. The readings it's putting out are already making the Guardians very nervous. And nervous Guardians are everybody's problem. Behind Kodai, Hal could see the crew moving, damage control teams, medical personnel, a woman with short hair coordinating, triage from a secondary station with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before and would likely have to do it again. An older man, silver-haired, the kind of stillness around him that either meant wisdom or medication, sat in the captain's chair to one side, watching Hal through the glass with eyes that had already done the math and found the answer acceptable. The Yamato had emerged from wherever it came from, into a universe that ran on different rules. Its crew didn't know that yet. They didn't know that 40,000 kilometers behind them, the most powerful police force in the known universe was convening an emergency session to decide whether a damaged warship from an unknown dimension was a rescue situation or a threat to be neutralized. They didn't know that somewhere in the dark between star systems, an apocalypse sensor array had just registered an energy signature it had never encountered before. And in the throne room of a world that was itself a weapon, Darkseid opened his eyes. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The Guardians of the Universe had existed for 3 billion years. They had watched civilizations rise and burn and rise again from their own ash. They had created the greatest peacekeeping force in recorded history, made mistakes large enough to scar the multiverse, and corrected those mistakes with the particular grim efficiency of beings who had learned that regret was only useful the first time. They did not panic. They did not rush. They convened, they deliberated, and they decided. They convened in 11 minutes. Ganthet stood at the center of the chamber, the own data feeds suspended in light above the council circle, the wave motion readings scrolling in columns that kept requiring the display system to invent new units. Around him, 12 Guardians watched the numbers with expressions that a human might have mistaken for calm and a more perceptive observer would have recognized as the concentrated stillness of very old, very powerful beings choosing their words before they had finished forming their thoughts. The energy signature is not from this universe, said a Guardian named Appa Ali APSA. The drive system displacement it created on emergence corresponds to no known dimensional transit method, not boom tube, not zeta beam, not speed force breach, not magical aperture of any cataloged variety. He paused. It came through something that our instruments are describing, somewhat embarrassingly, as a crack. A crack in what? Asked another Guardian. In the part of physics that was previously considered structural. Silence. The weapon, Ganthet said, is the primary concern. The wave motion discharge residue on the hull suggests it has been fired recently, and at significant scale. The energy yield of a full capacity discharge, extrapolated from the residual signature, would be sufficient to. He stopped. He looked at the number. He looked at it again. Sufficient to be a problem. He finished, which was owned for something that would have taken a human several sentences of profanity to express adequately. Jordan is aboard? Someone asked. Alongside, a Guardian at the monitoring station corrected. The crew has not granted boarding access. They are cooperative but not compliant. Captain's stated position is that the vessel is sovereign, territory of their Earth. Their Earth, Appa Ali APSA repeated, with the tone of someone filing that detail in a drawer labeled complications. Jordan's assessment. The feed from Hal's ring played at the center of the chamber. His voice came through with the particular cadence it got when he was making a judgment call and wanted the record to show he'd thought about it. They're not a threat in the way you're worried about. They're a crew that's been in combat and came out the other side still holding together by will and not much else. The captain is a pause. The captain is the kind of person who makes you want to be more careful about what you ask him to sacrifice, because he'll do it. That's not a threat assessment. That's a character assessment. I think they need medical support and hull repair and someone to explain where they are without making it sound like an interrogation. And the weapon? Ganthad asked. A longer pause from Hal. The weapon is real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But you don't defuse that situation by treating it like a weapon first. The Guardians deliberated for 4 more minutes, which in own terms was essentially a snap decision. The conclusion was this. Jordan would be permitted to continue his approach. A medical and engineering corps would be dispatched. The Yamato would be escorted to a monitoring position at a safe distance from OA. And a message would be sent to Sector 2814. Primary contact point, the Justice League Watchtower, flagging the situation as a Class 7 anomalous contact and requesting that a League representative travel to OA for briefing. The message reached the Watchtower at 0340 Eastern Standard Time. Clark Kent read it in the kitchen of his Metropolis apartment while making coffee, because his communicator had a priority filter and Class 7. Anomalous contact cleared it. He read it twice. He set down his mug. He went to the window and looked at the pre-dawn sky for a moment with the particular expression he got when something new had entered the world, and he was already trying to decide whether it needed hope or caution or both. He was in orbit in 40 seconds and at OA in under 3 minutes. Hal met him at the Yamato's observation deck side, both of them floating in the dark with the wounded ship filling their view like a monument to something stubborn and unresolved. Up close, the damage was worse than the sensor readings had suggested. The hull fractures ran deeper than the initial scan showed. 3 of the secondary turrets were completely offline. The wave motion gun's outer casing had stress fractures consistent with a firing angle that should have torn the barrel apart and hadn't, which said something about the engineering and something else about the desperation of whoever had pulled the trigger. Crew, Clark asked. 230 confirmed wounded, Hal said. 41 dead. They have a medical bay that's working past capacity and a chief medical officer who has apparently been awake for what the translation matrix is calling too many hours to be responsible. He glanced at Clark. They're from another universe. The Guardians confirmed it. Their dimensional origin point doesn't correspond to any known multiverse coordinate. Clark was quiet for a moment, looking at the flag still mounted at the ship's stern. What were they fighting? Don't know yet. The captain hasn't gotten that far into the conversation. Hal paused. He's not unfriendly. He's carrying something. You know how some people, you can tell the weight they're under just by looking at them? He's one of those. Clark nodded slowly. He understood that kind of weight better than most. I'm going to request permission to board, Clark said. They might say no. Then I'll ask again. He looked at Hal. But I'm not going to demand it. This ship. He paused, searching for the word. This ship came here from a fight it was losing. The least we owe them is the choice. Hal Jordan had worked with a lot of people. He had worked with the greatest heroes in the known universe, with new gods and immortal warriors and men and women who could reshape matter with a thought. He had learned over years of careful observation that the ones worth trusting were not the ones who led with their power. They were the ones who led with their manners. He opened the channel to the Yamato's bridge. Captain Kodai, Superman would like to request permission to come aboard. The pause on the other end lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Permission granted, Kodai said. The Yamato's corridors smelled like burned wiring and antiseptic and something older underneath both of those things. A smell that Clark Kent's senses decoded automatically, and that his mind categorized with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Blood, dried and recent, on the walls near the medical bay junction. Coolant fluid from a ruptured line that someone had patched with what appeared to be a section of uniform sleeve. The specific metallic tang of a ventilation system working at reduced capacity, recycling air through damaged filters. And beneath all of it, faint but persistent, something he had no reference for, the wave motion residue, up close, which his olfactory senses processed less as a smell and more as a pressure. A low frequency reminder that the physics in this corridor had recently been introduced to concepts it hadn't previously considered. He walked at human pace. He kept his hands visible. He had left the cape outside. Kodai met him at the intersection of the main corridor and the bridge access passage. And Clark's first impression was confirmed and deepened by proximity. The man was perhaps 30, perhaps younger, the kind of age that combat accelerates without completing. The dried blood above his eye had been cleaned away, but the skin beneath it was still tight and bruised. He stood straight in the particular way that people stand straight when straightening up is itself an act of will. He looked at Clark with dark eyes that were doing the same thing Clark's were doing, which was assessing without being obvious about assessing. And the mutual recognition of that process seemed to relax, something fractionally in both of them. Superman, Kodai said. The translation matrix had smoothed out since Hal's first contact, finding its rhythm with the crew's speech patterns. Clark is fine, Clark said, and then reconsidered because the man in front of him was a captain on his own ship receiving a foreign dignitary of unclear status, and some formalities served a purpose beyond ceremony. Superman, if you prefer. Either way, he looked past Kodai at the corridor beyond, at the crew members moving with the exhausted precision of people who had reduced their motion to only what was necessary. How can we help? Kodai's expression moved through several things quickly. Relief was in there, Clark noted, but it wasn't the kind of relief that relaxed. It was the kind that complicated, that added to an existing calculation rather than subtracting from it. Our wounded need medical attention, beyond what our facilities can currently provide. Our hull requires repair that we lack the materials for. He paused. We have people who need to know they are going to be all right. I would appreciate help with all three of those things. You'll have it, Clark said. Unconditionally. Kodai looked at him for a moment. Unconditionally, he repeated, as though testing the words structural integrity. Unconditionally, Clark confirmed. Something shifted behind the captain's eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the specific recalibration of someone who has prepared extensively for an adversarial conversation and is now being required to use different tools. Then I should tell you where we came from, Kodai said, and what we were fighting. Because I think, he glanced toward the bow of the ship, toward the sealed aperture of the wave motion gun at the Yamato's heart. I think some of what we were fighting may have followed us, he told Clark in the ship's small briefing room, with Yuki Mori present and a lantern dispatch translation specialist sitting quietly in the corner. And the story took 40 minutes and cost Kodai something visible to tell. The enemy had different names in different iterations of the Yamato's history. Gamala's, Comet Empire, Dingwall, but the shape of the threat was consistent. Extinction level, fleet scale, the specific variety of existential danger that requires a civilization to reach beyond its own capacity and build something that shouldn't exist to fight something that shouldn't have been allowed to get this far. The Yamato was that something. The wave motion gun was its answer to the question of how a single ship fights an armada. The last battle, Kodai said, his voice careful and level in the way that voices get when they are carrying more than they are saying. We fired the gun at full charge. The target was, he stopped. The target was something that would have ended everything. Our world. Probably others. He looked at his hands on the table. The discharge resonated with something it shouldn't have. A dimensional boundary. The wake of the firing tore an aperture. And before we could correct course, we were through it. He looked up. We have no idea if our shot connected. Clark sat with that for a moment. You fired your main weapon at full charge without knowing if it would work. We fired it, Kodai said, because not firing it was worse. In the corridor outside, Clark could hear the specific sounds of the medical support team the Guardians had dispatched moving through the ship, careful footsteps, the soft voices of healers working in an unfamiliar environment, the occasional sound of someone in pain becoming someone in slightly less pain. He could hear Yuki Mori's heartbeat, steady and tired and quietly fierce. He could hear the ship itself, its systems cycling and straining, the deep subsonic pulse of the wave motion, engine at low power like a second, heartbeat that operated on principles his Kryptonian biology processed as deeply, inexplicably familiar. Captain, Clark said, you mentioned something may have followed you. Kodai nodded slowly. When we came through the aperture, our rear sensors registered a contact, fleet scale. It was gone within seconds. Our sensors were damaged and we couldn't maintain the track. He met Clark's eyes. Whatever we were fighting, it had the capability to follow us through a dimensional breach. Whether it chose to is a question I don't have an answer to. Clark kept his expression neutral. He kept his voice level. He was very good at both of those things. I'm going to need to make some calls, he said. Yes, Kodai said. I imagined you would. He said it without bitterness, without resentment. He said it the way people say things when they have. Learn that asking for help is not weakness, but arithmetic. When you need more than you have, you find more, and you are grateful. And you do not confuse gratitude with dependency. Clark excused himself to the corridor and opened a priority channel to the watchtower. Batman, he said quietly. The response was immediate, because it always was. I've been reading the OWN reports since the Class 7 flag came through. Bruce's voice had the particular texture it got when he had already run several scenarios and found the ones he liked least to be the most probable. The wave motion gun energy signature is real, Clark confirmed. And the captain thinks something followed them through. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. I'll be there in 4 hours, Bruce said. Don't let the Guardians make any permanent decisions before I arrive. Bruce. And Clark. Another pause. Don't trust the ship unconditionally. Clark looked back through the briefing room window at Kodai, who had remained at the table and was now looking at a photograph he had taken from his uniform pocket, something small and personal, held with the careful grip of someone maintaining connection to a reason. I already did, Clark said quietly. He heard Bruce's silence process that information. Of course you did, Bruce said, and closed the channel. Batman arrived in 3 hours and 40 minutes, which meant he had left before he said he would and hadn't mentioned it, which was either efficiency or a statement about Clark's unconditional trust that he hadn't finished making yet. The Batwing docked at the OWN auxiliary port without requesting clearance, because Bruce had calculated that the Guardians would grant it and asking would take longer than arriving. And he walked into the monitoring center with the particular quality of presence that made beings 3 billion years old recalibrate their assumptions about baseline human capability. He spent 12 minutes reviewing the OWN data before speaking. Then he said, show me the wave motion gun discharge from their point of origin. The residual dimensional echo. Not the hull readings, the aperture geometry. Ganthet looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled the data. Bruce studied it for 4 more minutes. His expression did not change in any way that a casual observer would have noticed. Clark, who had known him for years and had learned to read the specific vocabulary of Bruce's stillness, noticed that his right hand stopped moving and that he breathed slightly slower for approximately 30 seconds, which meant he had found something that confirmed a scenario he had already considered and considered bad. The aperture didn't close completely, Bruce said. Ganthet's pause was brief but present. No, it collapsed to approximately 4% of its original diameter and has been contracting since. Our projection has its ceiling within 18 to 22 hours. And in the meantime, Bruce said, it is a dimensional breach, approximately large enough for a focused fleet formation to navigate. If they knew the geometry and had the drive technology to manage the transit stress, that is a theoretical possibility that you've already modeled, Bruce said. It wasn't a question. Another pause. Yes. And the energy on the other side of the aperture. What does it read as? This pause was the longest. Ganthet turned to the display and brought up a secondary feed that had not been in the initial briefing package, which told Bruce that the Guardians had been deciding how much to share and had just been outmaneuvered into sharing it. The readings bloomed across the display in columns of deep red and frequencies that the instruments labeled with warning indicators the way a map labels cliffs. Fleet scale, Bruce said quietly. Waiting. Clark arrived at the monitoring center in trance as Bruce said it, having left the Yamato after the medical teams confirmed they had the situation stable enough that his departure wouldn't feel like abandonment. He looked at the display. He looked at Bruce. How long have you known? Since you told me the captain thought something followed them, Bruce said. I ran the aperture geometry probabilities on the flight here. Whatever they were fighting is on the other side of that breach and has been there since the Yamato came through. It hasn't entered because he studied the readings. Because it's waiting for something. The aperture to widen. The gun to charge. A signal. Something. Or someone, Clark said. Bruce turned from the display. and looked at him with the expression that meant Clark had said something. Bruce had already considered, and Clark had arrived at it faster than Bruce had expected, which was as close to a compliment as the situation was likely to produce. We need to talk to Kodai now. They came aboard the Yamato together, which produced a visible effect on the crew, not the effect that Clark usually produced on people. The particular involuntary recalibration that happened when someone processed that the man in front of them could bench press a tectonic plate. But something different, something more like the feeling a crew gets when they realize that the people who have come to help them understand the situation as well as they do, which is both reassuring and frightening in equal measure. Kodai received them in the briefing room with Yuki Mori and his chief engineer, a broad-shouldered man named Tokugawa, who looked at Bruce's equipment with the specific professional interest of someone who respected good engineering regardless of its origin. The ship's analyzer unit, a robot with an oval head and a personality that the translation matrix rendered as relentlessly literal, had been set to continuous sensor monitoring and was providing updates to a secondary display in the corner, with the dedicated efficiency of a machine that had decided this situation warranted its full attention. Bruce placed his data pad on the table without preamble. The aperture your wave motion discharge created is still partially open. The energy readings on the other side indicate a fleet-scale presence that has been stationary since your transit. They haven't entered. We don't know why. We need to know what we're dealing with. He looked at Kodai. Everything. Not the summary. The full account of what you were fighting and what it's capable of. Kodai looked at him for a moment. You are the detective, he said. Not a question. Among other things, Bruce said. You don't trust us yet. I don't trust the situation yet, Bruce said, which was precise and accurate and kinder than most of his clarifications. I'm still evaluating. The crew I'm inclined toward. The ship. He glanced at the forward bulkhead in the direction of the wave motion gun. The ship I respect and am concerned about in equal measure. Something in Kodai's posture settled into the specific alignment of a person who has decided that honesty is the correct tactical choice, not because it's comfortable, but because it's efficient. He began to speak, and this time he held nothing back. The full tactical profile of the enemy fleet, their weapon systems, their demonstrated willingness to pursue targets across extraordinary distances, their capacity to absorb punishment that should have ended them, and their response to the wave motion gun specifically, which was not to retreat, but to adapt. Bruce listened without interrupting. Clark listened and watched Kodai's face. Yuki Mori watched Bruce with the focused attention of someone assessing an unknown variable and finding it more complex than initially categorized. When Kodai finished, the room was quiet for a moment. They adapt to the wave motion discharge, Bruce said, meaning a second firing at full charge would be less effective than the first. Potentially significantly less effective, Kodai confirmed. But you have one, Bruce said. One more full charge before adaptation makes it unreliable. Yes. Bruce looked at the display in the corner, at the analyzer's continuous readout, at the aperture readings still contracting at their slow, inexorable rate. Then we have 18 hours, he said, to decide whether to use it now on a target we can't fully see, wait and potentially lose the window, or find a third option that none of us have thought of yet. He looked at Clark. Clark looked at the table for a moment, then at Kodai. What would you do? He asked the captain. If it were entirely your decision. Kodai's answer came without hesitation, which meant it was not an impulsive answer but a considered one that had been sitting in him since before they arrived, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I would not fire until I could see what I was firing at, he said. My crew has given enough. I will not spend the last shot on a guess. Bruce's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters in a direction. That meant he had just upgraded his assessment of Captain Susumu Kodai of the space Battleship Yamato by a significant margin. All right, he said. Then we find a way to see. The partial firing had been felt across 6 sectors. This was not a metaphor. This was not the kind of felt that meant impressive or significant or worth noting in a patrol report. This was the kind of felt that meant the emotional spectrum, the fundamental cosmic architecture, through which willpower and fear and hope and rage expressed themselves as light and power, and the basic operating grammar of the universe had experienced something it did not have a category for, and had responded the way any complex system responds to an uncategorized input, which was to briefly and completely lose its composure. Hal Jordan's ring had flickered for 4 seconds during the Yamato's partial discharge test. 4 seconds was nothing in human terms. In Green Lantern terms, 4 seconds of ring failure in a combat situation was the difference between a construct and a crater. The Guardians had the data. The other Corps had the data. Because the spectrum didn't have a privacy setting, when something hit it, everything sensitive to it registered the impact simultaneously. The way a chord played in a large room is heard in every corner regardless of where you're standing. The question was not whether others had noticed. The question was which of them would arrive first. Hal was on the Yamato's hull with a core engineering team when his ring flagged the incoming signature, and he processed the information with the specific quality of calm that experienced pilots develop for moments when the situation upgrades itself without asking permission. He finished the weld he was running on a secondary hull fracture, because leaving it half done was worse than stopping. And then he straightened up and looked at the direction the signature was coming from. Red. Deep, arterial, furious red, moving at a velocity that suggested whoever was wearing that ring had been flying since before. Hal got the alert and had not slowed down once. He opened a channel to the briefing room. "We have incoming. Red Lantern, single contact, moving fast. I'm going to go have a conversation." Define conversation. Bruce's voice came back immediately. "The kind where I talk first, and he doesn't immediately set anything on fire." Hal said, "I'll let you know how it goes." The Red Lantern's name was Zilius Zox, and he was roughly spherical and made almost entirely of teeth and outrage. And he stopped approximately 200 meters from the Yamato and radiated the specific energy of someone who has flown a very long way with a very clear purpose and is now being required to not immediately execute that purpose because a Green Lantern is in the way. His ring light pulsed with the deep red of burning blood. Behind him, the wave motion residue on the Yamato's hull glowed faintly in the same frequency, and the resonance between the two made Hal's ring emit a low warning tone. "That ship," Zilius said. His translator function rendered his voice as something between a growl and a structural failure. "What it fired, what it did to the spectrum." "I know," Hal said. "I was here." The Red Lanterns felt it as an attack. "It wasn't an attack," Hal said. "It was a partial discharge. Test by a crew that didn't know the spectrum existed 48 hours ago." He kept his body language open, his ring at ambient glow rather than combat brightness. "They're from another universe, Zilius. Completely different dimensional origin. They didn't know what they were touching." "Ignorance," Zilius said, "does not repair the spectrum." "No," Hal agreed. "It doesn't. But it does change the response calculus." He paused. "I need you to talk to me before you do anything else. That's all I'm asking. Talk first." The red light pulsed. Pulsed again. Then, with the specific grudging quality of rage that has been interrupted at a sufficient moment to allow reason a brief foothold, Zilius Zox lowered himself to a relative hover and said, "Talk." Inside the Yamato, Bruce had moved to the sensor station the moment Hal's alert came through, pulling the Red Lanterns approach data and cross-referencing it with everything the own database had on. Spectrum sensitivity to exotic energy sources. Clark stood beside him, and there was a version of this moment where Clark would have gone outside to assist Hal immediately, but Bruce had said quietly, "Hal can handle a single Red Lantern, and I need you in here." And Clark had recognized the specific tone that meant Bruce was tracking something larger than the immediate contact. "The spectrum sensitivity," Clark said. "How bad is it?" "The partial discharge at roughly 30% charge produced a spectrum disruption, measurable across 6 sectors," Bruce said, his fingers moving across the display. "Full charge, the kind Kodai says they fired before transit, would produce a disruption. Measurable across." He stopped. He recalculated. He looked at the number with the expression that had become his default expression since boarding this ship, which was the expression of someone who keeps finding new floors below the floor they thought was the bottom, across every active ring in the known universe, simultaneously, for somewhere between 8 and 15 seconds. Clark was quiet for a moment. Every ring, every ring, every core. Green, yellow, red, blue, all of them. 8 to 15 seconds of complete failure. Bruce looked at him, during which time the fleet on the other side of that aperture could transit unopposed through a universe that had just lost its primary defensive infrastructure. Clark understood immediately. He always did, even when he wished he didn't. They weren't following the Yamato, he said. They were using it. The wave motion gun fires, the spectrum collapses, and they walk through an undefended breach. Into a universe, Bruce said, where the Justice League, the Green Lantern Corps, every power ring wielder from here to the edge of the source wall is temporarily blind and powerless. He paused. It's a good plan. Tactically, it's a very good plan. It's monstrous, Clark said. Yes, Bruce agreed. It's both of those things. Kodai had been standing at the secondary sensor station listening to the translation feed with the stillness of a man receiving information. He had been subconsciously bracing for since the moment he understood they were not alone in this new universe. Yuki Mori stood beside him, and her hand had found his arm at some point in the last 30 seconds. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, but of anchoring the specific physical language of two people who have survived enough together that proximity is its own communication. They used us, Kodai said. His voice was level. The levelness cost him. Your ship is the trigger mechanism, Bruce said, and the directness of it was not cruelty. It was the specific respect of someone who believes the person in front of them can handle the truth and will be better served by it than by a gentler version. The wave motion gun is the most powerful exotic energy weapon in this universe right now. One full discharge would do exactly what they need, whether you intend it to or not. Kodai looked at the sealed aperture of the wave motion gun on the forward display for a long moment. Then I won't fire it, he said. The problem, Bruce said, is that the fleet on the other side of that aperture has approximately 16 hours to find a way to make you through the observation port. The red glow of Zilius Sox's ring pulsed against the stars like a warning. Light on a system approaching critical. Hal's green answered it, steady and persistent. The negotiation continuing in the patient language of two people who both understood that the alternative to talking was much worse than the conversation. Deeper in the ship, in the engineering bay where Tokagawa's team worked alongside the own engineers with the focused, collaborative intensity of people who have discovered that good engineering is a language that crosses dimensional boundaries. The wave motion engine turned at low power. Its pulse moved through the hull. It moved through the deck plates. It moved through the boots of every crew member and into the specific frequency that the emotional spectrum had no name for and that every ring in 6 sectors had already learned to recognize. In the dark between the stars, on the other side of a closing wound in the fabric of space, something massive and patient and very old began to move. New Genesis arrived without announcement, which was how New Genesis preferred it. The boom tube opened at a respectful distance from the Yamato, respectful by New God standards, which meant approximately 8,000 kilometers, which was the spatial equivalent of knocking before entering if knocking involved a dimensional aperture the size of a small moon. Through it came a single craft, sleek and golden and radiating the specific quality of technology that has transcended the distinction between machine and philosophy. Behind the craft, visible through the closing boom tube for just a moment, was the brightness of New Genesis itself, a world that looked the way hope would look if hope were an ecosystem. Orion stepped from the craft into open space without a suit, because new gods did not require suits, and because Orion specifically would have considered a suit in implication that the vacuum posed a threat worth acknowledging. He was broad and dark-haired and carried the particular gravity of someone whose entire existence was the product of a war between absolute good and absolute evil, raised on the wrong side and chosen for the right one. And the contradiction had produced in him something that was not quite patience and not quite fury, but lived in the charged space between them. His astro harness burned gold against the stars. His eyes found the Yamato immediately and assessed it with the professional thoroughness of a warrior who had spent his life evaluating things that could kill him. Hal Jordan moved to intercept out of protocol rather than genuine concern. Orion. Jordan. Orion's voice in vacuum carried the way. New God voices always carried. Through means that physics was politely pretending not to notice. Highfather sends his awareness of the situation and his considered recommendation, which is that the vessel and its crew are not the threat. Orion looked at the Yamato with the specific attention he gave to things he respected and was not yet sure he should. The threat is what follows them. Highfather has seen it in the source. He paused. He describes it as a hunger that learned to organize itself. I'll process that. That's not a tactical profile. No, Orion agreed. It is something more accurate than a tactical profile. He turned from the Yamato to look at the aperture coordinates, invisible to unaugmented eyes but lit in his awareness by his astro harness sensors. It does not want territory. It does not want resources. It wants the wave motion gun to fire, the spectrum to collapse. And then it wants everything that remains. Another pause. Highfather believes they have encountered this hunger before. In the universe the ship comes from. Multiple times. Different forms, same appetite. Clark, monitoring the exchange through Hal's ring feed from inside the Yamato, turned to Bruce. Different forms. Same appetite, he said quietly. Bruce had already pulled the data from Kodai's full tactical briefing and was running it against Orion's description. The pattern recognition took him less than 30 seconds, which was 30 seconds of silence. That Kodai and Yukimori and Tokugawa all recognized as the silence of a very fast mind arriving somewhere significant. The enemy in their universe, Bruce said. Each iteration, Gamala's Comet Empire. The others, Kodai described them as having different motivations, different methods, different biological origins. He looked at the display, but the same strategic behavior, maximum force, extinction-level threat, and always a single point of vulnerability that the Yamato was specifically capable of exploiting. He stopped. They weren't different enemies. They were the same thing testing different approaches, Clark said. Finding the right key, Bruce said. For the right lock. He turned to Kodai. Your ship wasn't built to fight these enemies. Your ship was built by these enemies, specifically designed to produce the wave motion discharge they needed. Every battle you've ever fought, every victory, every time the Yamato saved your world, it was the process of a weapon learning to aim itself. The briefing room was very quiet. Yukimori spoke first, and her voice was the specific voice of someone who is angry, in the way that people are angry when they have been used, without their knowledge for something they would never have agreed to. That's not possible, she said. We built the Yamato ourselves. The technology came from, she stopped. From a Gamala's source, Kodai said, slowly, as though the words were heavier than they had been 30 seconds ago. The original wave motion engine technology, the initial schematics, they came from Star Shah of Iskander, but she received them from, he stopped again. From the first contact, Bruce said. Which was? Kodai looked at the table. Which was Gamala's? The silence extended. Clark watched Kodai process it, watched the specific quality of a person working through the discovery that the story they have been living has a different shape than the one they understood, that the victories they paid for in blood and loss in the specific currency of human sacrifice were real victories against real enemies who were also in some architecture of intent too large to see from inside it, exactly where they were supposed to be. He watched Kodai find the bottom of that and come back up from it with the particular resilience of someone who has learned that the ground moving beneath you is not the same as the ground not being there. It doesn't change what we fought for, Kodai said, not defiantly, factually. No, Clark said. It doesn't. It changes, Kodai said carefully, what we do next. He looked at Bruce. You said they need the gun to fire, which means they need me to fire it, which means as long as I choose not to, we have leverage. Leverage and a closing window, Bruce said. The aperture seals in approximately 14 hours. After that, the transit becomes geometrically impossible regardless of their drive technology. If we can hold the gun silent for 14 hours, the breach closes and the immediate threat ends. And the long-term threat? Yukimori asked. Bruce looked at her steadily. The aperture closes. Whatever is on the other side stays on the other side. But a thing that has been hunting your ship across multiple iterations of its own existence, that engineered the weapon that has been your world's salvation, that followed you. Orion's voice came through the open channel from outside, the feed running through Hal's ring connection. He had clearly been listening. Highfather agrees with the detective's assessment, Orion said, with the tone of someone who does not often agree with detectives and is finding the experience interesting. He offers New Genesis's full military support for the 14-hour window. Whatever comes through that aperture before it closes will find New Genesis waiting. The Green Lantern Corps is already positioned, Hal added. Clark looked at Kodai. Captain, your crew needs rest, and your ship needs repair, and you have 14 hours to hold a trigger. You were apparently built to pull. He paused. What do you need from us? Kodai looked around the briefing room, at Yuki, at Tokugawa, at the analyzer still running its continuous feed in the corner, at the display showing the Yamatos, damage profile and the apertures, contraction rate and the massed energy, signatures on the other side of a closing wound in space. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man who had been given impossible situations before and had learned that the impossibility was not the point. I need my crew to eat, he said. I need my wounded to be treated. I need my hull to hold. He met Clark's eyes. And I need someone to tell me that if something comes through that aperture in the next 14 hours, your people can handle it without the gun. Clark held his gaze. My people, he said, have been handling things that shouldn't exist since before I arrived here. Yes. Kodai nodded once. Then he straightened, and the weight he carried redistributed itself into something that was still heavy, but was also somehow load-bearing. The weight of a decision made clearly, carried forward with full knowledge of its cost. Then we hold, he said, deep in the Yamato's engineering bay. Tokugawa placed his hand on the wave motion, engine housing, and felt it pulse against his palm like a second heart, patient and vast and waiting, and thought about what it meant to be a weapon that had decided to be something else. The first probe came through at hour 3. It was small, the size of a ground vehicle, roughly ovoid. Its hull made of something that the own instruments classified as metal before upgrading the classification to organized metal and then abandoning classification entirely and simply noting that it absorbed sensor returns the way a black hole absorbs light, completely and without reflection. It transited the aperture at high velocity and immediately began broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, a signal that the translation matrix processed as something between a targeting solution and an invitation. The specific combination of those two things that means the difference between them has been deliberately collapsed. Orion destroyed it in 4 seconds, with a blast from his astro harness that left a brief, clean void where the probe had been. He reported the engagement to Hal with the tone of someone swatting an insect and noting it for the record. They're mapping our response time, Bruce said from the Yamato sensor station, where he had been for the past 3 hours, sleeping in the chair for approximately 40 minutes, when Clark had physically insisted and returning immediately after. Speed, firepower, positioning. That probe's job was to die informatively. How many more do you think they send? Hal asked through the channel. As many as it takes to complete the picture, Bruce said. Then they'll send something that uses the picture. He was right. The second probe came at hour 5. Different geometry, different transit vector. Destroyed by a Green Lantern construct in 6 seconds. The third at hour 7. And this one didn't move after transit. It simply stopped and broadcast for 2 seconds before Orion reached it. And in those 2 seconds it had transmitted a targeting solution of sufficient detail that Bruce spent the following hour redesigning the defensive positioning, redistributing the lantern coverage, moving Orion's patrol route in a way that Orion received without comment and implemented without deviation. Because whatever else Orion was, he was a warrior who recognized competent tactical thinking and treated it with the respect it deserved regardless of its source. Clark spent the first 6 hours moving between the Yamatos, medical bay, and its crew quarters. Because the own medical team was excellent, but they were aliens, working in an unfamiliar environment. And there were crew members for whom treatment required a degree of trust that was easier to extend when someone recognizably human was present to bridge the gap. He carried equipment. He translated body language. He sat with a 19-year-old navigation officer named Shima for 40 minutes, while the own healers worked on the young man's injuries, talking about nothing consequential. Metropolis. What Earth looked like from orbit. The specific quality of sunlight on water. Because 19-year-olds who have been in combat need someone to remind them that the universe contains things worth returning to. He was in the medical bay when Yuki Mori found him at hour 8, and her expression told him before she spoke that the situation had developed in a direction that required his immediate attention. The captain is gone, she said. Clark was at the bridge in 4 seconds. Yuki was half a minute behind him, having run. The bridge crew looked at Clark with the specific expression of people who have made a decision they know is going to require explanation, which meant they knew where Kodai was and had chosen not to stop him. Where? Clark said. The young ensign at the communications station. A boy who could not have been more than 18, with the kind of face that expressed everything it felt without knowing it was. Doing so, pointed forward, toward the bow, toward the wave motion gun. The gun room was at the base of the main cannon, a space that existed at the intersection of engineering and ceremony, the place where the weapon's firing mechanism was housed, alongside the controls that armed and aimed and ultimately released what the wave motion engine had gathered. It was a room that smelled of purpose, of the specific gravity that attaches to places where irreversible decisions are made. Kodai was there, standing at the firing console, and he was not alone. A boom tube had opened at some point in the previous 2 hours and deposited someone through it before anyone on the defensive perimeter had registered the transit, which meant it had not come from the aperture, which meant it had come from somewhere else entirely. The figure standing beside Kodai at the console was tall and gray-armored, and radiated the particular quality of absolute certainty that Clark recognized immediately and viscerally, the way you recognize a smell that has been present in your worst memories. Desad, Darkseid's torturer, his engineer of suffering, his voice in situations where Darkseid wished to communicate something important through the medium of precisely calculated pain. He stood beside Kodai, with his hands folded and his expression arranged in the specific configuration of someone who has already won and is waiting for the other party to finish. Arriving at that conclusion, Superman, Desad said. His voice was the vocal equivalent of a room you realize you've been locked inside. How gratifying. I had hoped you would come quickly. The captain and I were just reaching an understanding. Clark looked at Kodai. Kodai's face was the face of a man who was angry in the specific way that people are angry when they have been maneuvered into a position they recognize but cannot immediately escape, not trapped by force but by the architecture of the situation, by the specific arrangement of consequences around a single point of choice. He has something, Kodai said. His voice was controlled and furious in equal measure. He has someone. Her name, Desad said pleasantly, is not important to you yet. It will become important to you shortly. She is alive and will remain so in direct proportion to the captain's cooperation, with a very simple request. Clark had his hands at his sides and his heat vision behind his eyes and his entire body at the specific tension of someone choosing not to move because moving incorrectly would be worse than not moving. What request, he said. The gun, Desad said. One firing. Full charge. Aimed at the aperture. He tilted his head. Darkseid has been watching the tactical situation develop with considerable admiration. The fleet on the other side is not his, you understand. They are competition, an extinction-level threat from a universe Darkseid has not yet had the opportunity to conquer. He finds that professionally objectionable. He paused. One wave motion discharged through the aperture would destroy the fleet before transit. The aperture's dimensional geometry would focus and amplify the discharge to an extraordinary degree. The threat ends. The spectrum collapses for the detective's estimate was 8 to 15 seconds. Darkseid's estimate is closer to 25. Sufficient time for Apocalypse forces already pre-positioned in this universe to neutralize the Green Lantern Corps, New Genesis, and several other obstacles that have historically impeded Lord Darkseid's ambitions. The room was very quiet. He eliminates his competition, Clark said, and blinds everyone who could stop him. Simultaneously, two problems, Desad agreed. Warmly, resolved by one weapon neither of them built. He looked at Kodai. The captain understands the mathematics. He is a man of considerable intelligence and terrible circumstances. He knows that the fleet on the other side of that aperture will end everything if it transits unopposed. He knows that firing the gun delivers Lord Darkseid a window of opportunity he has sought for decades. He is being asked to choose between two extinctions. Desad smiled. I find these moments clarifying. Kodai looked at Clark. In his eyes was something that Clark had seen in mirrors. In the dark, in the specific hours, when the weight of what he was capable of and what he was being asked to do and what he had already decided he would not do all occupied the same space simultaneously. The look of a man at the absolute limit of what his integrity could hold without either breaking or becoming something else. Where is she? Clark said to Desad, quietly, with a quality of stillness that the room recognized as the inverse of calm. Safely distant, Desad said. Beyond your ability to retrieve in any time frame relevant to the current decision. You're wrong about that, Clark said. Am I? Desad seemed genuinely curious. Clark looked at Kodai. Don't touch that console, he said. Not yet. Then, he looked at Desad and the quality of his eyes changed in the specific way that it changed when Clark Kent stepped fully aside and left only Superman in the room. You have 30 seconds to tell me exactly where she is. After that I find her anyway, and you've wasted 30 seconds. Desad looked at him for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible the way calculations are visible in people who have never learned to hide them because they have never needed to. Then, with the precise instinct of a survivor who has lasted as long as he has by recognizing exactly when a threat is not a performance, he told Superman where she was. Clark was gone before the sentence finished. Kodai stood alone at the firing console, his hand 6 inches from the controls, and listened to the wave motion. Engine pulse beneath his feet like a question, waiting for an answer. Clark returned in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The crew member, a young woman named Akira, a communications technician who had been taken during a EVA repair shift by a boom tube that opened beneath her feet, with the specific precision of something that had been planned well in advance, was conscious and uninjured and shaking with the particular tremors of someone whose body has processed fear and is now processing relief, which is its own kind of violence. Clark set her down gently in the medical bay, said 3 sentences to the own healer on duty, and was back in the gun room in the same minute. Desad was gone. The boom tube residue was already fading. Kodai was still at the console. His hand had not moved. Clark looked at him for a moment, at the 6 inches between Kodai's hand and the firing controls, at the quality of stillness that had kept that distance constant through 4 minutes and 11 seconds of absolute uncertainty about whether the person taken from his crew would come back alive. He looked at it the way you look at something that deserves to be seen clearly before anything else is said about it. She's safe, Clark said. Kodai's hand dropped from the console. He turned away from it and sat down on the engineering housing behind him with the specific quality of dissent that isn't weakness, but is the body's honest accounting of what it has just spent. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and breathed. I wasn't going to fire it, he said. I know, Clark said. I want to be clear about that, Kodai said. I wasn't going to fire it regardless. He looked up. But I want you to understand that not firing it, knowing what is on the other side of that aperture, knowing what it will do if it transits, that was the hardest decision I have ever made. Harder than the ones where I fired. He paused. Because those decisions had clear enemies. This one had too. Clark sat down across from him on a secondary housing, which put them at eye level, which was a choice rather than a convenience. You made the right call, he said. I made a call, Kodai said. Whether it was right depends on what happens in the next. He checked the display above the console. 6 hours. Bruce's voice came through Clark's communicator before he could respond. Superman. Gunroom. Now. The specific texture of Bruce's voice that meant he had found the next layer down. Clark looked at Kodai. Come with me, he said. You should hear this. The sensor station had become Bruce's operational center in the way that Bruce's operational centers always became. Through the gradual, unremarked accumulation of his focus and the reorganization of the available information into the architecture his mind required. He had pulled data from the OWN monitoring array, from Orion's astro harness sensors, from the Yamato's own damaged but functional sensor suite, and from something he had apparently requested from New Genesis through a channel Clark hadn't been aware was open, and he had arranged it on the display in the configuration of a conclusion he had not yet voiced. Orion stood in the doorway. He had come aboard at some point in the last hour, which meant something had changed in the external situation that warranted his physical presence rather than channel communication. Hal Jordan floated at the observation port, which he had apparently phased through rather than use the airlock, because at this point the Yamato's crew had stopped being surprised by the things the people helping them could do and had simply incorporated it into their operational picture. The probes, Bruce said, without preamble, the moment Clark and Kodai entered. The targeting data they were gathering wasn't for the aperture defense. We assumed they were mapping our response capability to inform a transit strategy. He brought up the compiled probe data on the display. They were mapping the Yamato, specifically the wave motion gun's external housing, the aperture geometry, the barrel stress fractures, the specific harmonic frequency the engine produces at low power idle. He paused. They don't need Kodai to fire the gun. The room processed that. They've built a trigger, Hal said. They're building one, Bruce corrected. The probe data was the measurement phase. They have the specifications now. Given what Orion's sensors are reading from the energy signatures on the other side of the aperture, they have approximately, he checked the calculation, 90 minutes before they have a device capable of remotely inducing a wave motion discharge at full charge. It would bypass the firing console entirely. It would bypass the captain's choice entirely. He looked at Kodai steadily. They accounted for the possibility that you wouldn't cooperate. Kodai absorbed this with the expression of someone who has learned that the architecture of an impossible situation has one more floor below the floor they found. What does the device need to function? He said. Specifically, proximity, Bruce said. Within approximately 2,000 kilometers of the gun housing. Direct line of sight to the barrel stress fractures. Those are the induction points. And the wave motion engine needs to be running at any power level above absolute zero. He paused. Shutting down the engine entirely would prevent induction. But at zero power, the Yamato loses structural integrity within minutes. The hull repairs are insufficient to hold the ship together without active wave motion field support. So we can't shut down the engine, Yuki Mori said from the secondary station, where she had been running the numbers in parallel and arriving at the same place. Bruce had, because she was very good at her work. And we can't let the device get within 2,000 kilometers. Which is inside the defensive perimeter, Hal said. Which is inside the defensive perimeter, Bruce confirmed. Orion straightened in the doorway. Then nothing gets within 2,000 kilometers, he said, with the tone of someone stating a fact that has not yet occurred but intends to. There's something else, Bruce said. He brought up a secondary display, the aperture readings, the contraction rate, the timeline. The remote trigger device, once activated, will produce a wave motion discharge that is not a clean firing. The gun was designed to fire in a specific direction with a specific charge buildup sequence. A forced induction bypasses the sequence. The discharge will be omnidirectional. He let that sit for a moment. Not aimed at the aperture, not aimed at the fleet, aimed at everything within range simultaneously. The spectrum collapse would not be 8 to 15 seconds. How long? Clark said. Bruce looked at the number for a moment, with the expression he reserved for numbers that had stopped being theoretical. Indefinitely, he said. A forced omnidirectional wave motion discharge at full charge, given the dimensional resonance properties we've already measured, would not produce a temporary spectrum collapse. It would produce a permanent one. He paused. The emotional spectrum would cease to function. Permanently. Every ring, every core, gone. The word landed in the room and stayed there. They don't want a window, Clark said quietly. They don't want 25 seconds while Darkseid moves his pieces. They want the permanent removal of the primary defensive infrastructure of this universe, Bruce said, after which transit is not a tactical operation. It's a migration. Hal Jordan had gone very still at the observation port. His ring was at full brightness. Not combat ready, but the way a light gets bright when the hand holding it tightens involuntarily. Every ring, he said. Not a question, not even really a statement. Just the specific sound of someone putting language to the shape of a loss that doesn't have a human scale. Every ring, Bruce said. Clark stood in the center of the room and felt the weight of it. The Yamato's pulse through the deck plates. The 6 hours left on the aperture clock. The 90 minutes before the trigger device was operational. The fleet beyond the breach and the universe that had no idea what was being decided in this damaged ship at the edge of OA. He felt it the way he felt things that were too large to resolve through strength alone, where the question was not what he could do, but what needed to be done by someone capable of choosing clearly when every option cost something real. He looked at Kodai. Kodai was looking at the wave motion gun display, the damage schematic, the stress fractures, the barrel geometry that a thing from another universe had spent probe after probe measuring with the patience of a predator that has decided waiting is a form of certainty. He was looking at it the way he had looked at the photograph in the briefing room, with the specific quality of attention that means you are seeing something clearly because you have decided that. Clarity is what the moment requires regardless of what clarity costs. The stress fractures, Kodai said, in the barrel housing, if they were structurally compromised beyond the induction threshold, the remote trigger wouldn't work, Bruce said immediately. The induction points would be disrupted. The forced discharge would fail. He paused. But compromising the barrel housing at that level would also render the wave motion gun non-functional. Permanently? Yuki asked. Bruce looked at Kodai. Permanently, he said. The room waited. Kodai looked at his ship's weapon, the thing that had saved his world, the thing that had been used to save it, the thing that had apparently been built into the architecture of his universes, survival by something that intended all along for this moment. He looked at it the way you look at something you have carried so long that setting it down feels like amputation. Show me where to cut, he said. They had 40 minutes before the trigger device reached operational threshold. Bruce had the structural specifications on the display before Kodai finished the sentence, cross-referenced with the Yamato's engineering schematics and the probe data the enemy had spent 3 days gathering, which turned out to be extraordinarily useful for identifying exactly which structural points needed to be compromised to deny the induction pathway. The irony of using the enemy's reconnaissance to defeat the enemy's weapon was not lost on anyone in the room and was noted by no one aloud, because there was no time for it, and because some ironies are too large and too bitter to be worth the breath. Tokugawa was in the gun room in 6 minutes with 2 of his senior engineers, moving with the controlled urgency of men who understood exactly what they were being asked to do and had decided that understanding it fully was more important than being comfortable with it. The wave motion gun had been the Yamato's heart for as long as any of them had served aboard her. Dismantling its firing capability was not a technical operation. It was an amputation performed by surgeons who loved the patient. They worked anyway. Bruce coordinated from the sensor station, feeding Tokugawa precise targeting coordinates for the structural cuts, updating the calculations in real time as the probe data refined the picture. Clark stood at the observation port and watched the aperture coordinates, 6 hours, remained on the closure timeline, and the energy readings from the other side had changed quality in the last 30 minutes, shifting from the patient stillness of a predator conserving energy to something more active, more directed, the specific signature of a system approaching readiness. They knew their trigger was being denied. They were accelerating. Orion, Clark said into the channel. I see it, Orion said. He was 3,000 kilometers out, between the Yamato and the aperture, and his astro harness was at full burn. They are consolidating near the aperture threshold, preparing for transit. How many? A pause that contained a calculation. Enough, Orion said, which from Orion was not pessimism but precision. The specific word of a warrior who has assessed the opposition and chosen accuracy over comfort. The core is in position, Hal said from his patrol route above the Yamato's dorsal hull. Full ring capacity. Every lantern in range responded to the emergency call. We have green, blue, and indigo represented. Even got a couple of violet. A pause. No red. Zilius went home angry. But honestly, that might be better for everyone's concentration. New Genesis has deployed the full Celestial Defense Force, Orion said. Highfather himself is present. Clark turned from the observation port. Bruce. Timeline. Tokugawa needs 18 more minutes, Bruce said. The trigger device reaches operational threshold in, he checked. 31 minutes. We have a 13-minute margin if nothing changes. He paused. Something will change. It changed in 4 minutes. The aperture, which had been contracting steadily on its 16-hour timeline, stopped contracting. The dimensional geometry held at its current diameter, not closing, not widening, simply holding at the specific size that allowed a focused formation to transit, while denying passage to anything larger. It was not a natural stabilization. The instruments were unanimous on that point and unanimous in their inability to explain the mechanism. And Bruce looked at the readings with the expression he used when something had happened that he had considered and discarded as too sophisticated, which meant he needed to revise his assessment of what he was dealing with. They stabilized the aperture, he said. From the other side, they have dimensional engineering capability, significantly beyond what the probe data implied, meaning they can hold it open, Clark said. Meaning they can hold it open indefinitely, Bruce said. The 16-hour closure window is gone. The aperture is now a permanent feature, until they choose otherwise, or we find a way to force it closed. From this side, he looked at the display. The 13-minute margin just became irrelevant. They don't need the trigger device anymore. They can transit at will. Then why haven't they? Yukimori said. Everyone looked at her. They stabilized the aperture, she said. They've had transit capability for the last 4 minutes. But they haven't moved. Why? Bruce looked at the readings. He looked at them with the focused intensity of someone pulling a thread. They're waiting, he said slowly, for the trigger device. They still want the discharge. He pulled up the energy signature analysis, the behavioral data, the pattern. They don't just want to transit. They want to transit through a universe whose primary defenses are permanently offline. The aperture stability gives them the door. The trigger device gives them the darkness. He paused. They will not move until they have both. Then we take away the second option permanently, Clark said. He opened the channel to the gunroom. Tokugawa. How long? 14 minutes, Tokugawa said. His voice had the quality of a man doing something irrevocable with his hands and speaking through it. You have 12, Clark said. I'm sorry. A brief silence. Then Tokugawa said something in his own language that the translation matrix rendered as an affirmation and a profanity simultaneously, which was probably accurate. The sounds of accelerated work followed. Clark looked at Bruce. When the barrel housing is compromised, the trigger fails, but they'll know immediately. The induction frequency will drop off their sensors. They'll know the gun is gone. Yes, Bruce said. And they'll transit. Yes. Everything we have needs to be at the aperture when that happens, Clark said. The moment Tokugawa makes the cut, the core and New Genesis need to be at maximum engagement posture. He paused. And I need to be at the aperture. Bruce looked at him steadily. Clark. I know, Clark said. The transit formation will be fleet scale. Whatever comes through that aperture. I know what comes through, Clark said quietly. I know what it's capable of. VE read every engagement record in Kodai's briefing twice. He met Bruce's eyes. I also know that Hal and Orion and Highfather and the full Green Lantern Corps will be there. I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing it first. Bruce held his gaze for a moment with the expression he used when he had run the scenarios and found that the one he liked least was the one Clark had already chosen. And he had the choice of objecting or preparing. And preparing was more useful. I'll coordinate the defensive positioning from here, he said. The Yamato's sensors give me the best angle on the aperture geometry. I can direct the core placement in real time. Good, Clark said. He turned to Kodai, who had been standing at the entrance to the sensor station listening, with the stillness of a man who has passed a decision to other hands, and is now watching those hands to see if they were worth trusting. Captain, when this is over, Kodai said, is after. Talk to me after. Clark nodded. He went to the observation port and looked at the aperture. Coordinates one more time. The invisible wound in space that had brought a ghost ship and its crew of the exhausted and the determined, into a universe of gods. And that was about to become the threshold of the worst thing Clark had ever faced. Without knowing exactly what it was, he heard Tokugawa's voice in the channel, counting down. He heard Bruce's voice directing the Corps into final position, precise and calm, the coordinates flowing from the Yamato's sensor array, through Bruce's mind and out into the formation like a current finding its path. He heard Hal Jordan, somewhere above, say to no one in particular, "Lanterns. Whatever comes through that hole, we hold the line. That's what the ring is for." He heard Orion, distant and bright. New Genesis stands. He heard, beneath all of it, the Yamato's pulse, the wave motion engine at low power, the heartbeat of a ship that had crossed dimensions to arrive at this moment, that had been built as a weapon and had spent its existence, choosing to be something else, that was about to lose the capability that had defined it and was still, somehow, holding together. Tokugawa's countdown reached 0. The sound that came from the gun room was not dramatic. It was the sound of precise engineering applied to a specific point, a controlled severance, a clean break made by people who knew what they were cutting and had decided that knowing made it their responsibility, rather than someone else's. The induction frequency dropped off the enemy's sensors. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the aperture exploded with transit signatures, fleet scale and simultaneous. The accumulated patience of a thing that had been hunting across dimensions and iterations finally released into motion, and Clark Kent stepped away from the observation port and let the yellow sun that lived in every cell of his body have everything it had been quietly storing. And he hit the aperture threshold at a velocity that registered on the own instruments as a new entry in the speed category. And he was not alone because Hal was beside him and Orion was beside him and the green light of 10,000 rings was behind him. And the darkness came through the aperture like a tide that had been building since before this universe had a name. And the Yamato held its position, and its crew watched through the observation ports with the specific quality of attention that people give to things they cannot affect but refuse to look away from, the absolute, unflinching witness of people who have learned that some battles are fought by others and the only thing you can give them is the knowledge that someone is watching, that someone is counting, that what they are doing is seen and will be remembered. The battle lasted 47 minutes. The aperture closed 11 minutes after the last transit signature went dark. Not gradually, not on the contraction schedule that the own instruments had projected before the enemy stabilized it from the other side. It closed the way a wound closes when the thing causing it has been removed. Suddenly, completely, with the specific finality of a system, returning to its natural state because the unnatural pressure against it has ended. The dimensional geometry collapsed inward, and the breach that had brought the Yamato to this universe and nearly brought something else sealed itself with a sound that was not a sound but that every ring bearer in the sector felt as a release. A pressure lifting, the specific relief of a held breath finally let go. The lanterns felt their rings stabilize and brighten. The blue light of the Hope Core flared briefly across the sector before settling back to ambient, the way a fire flares when fresh oxygen reaches it. Orion's astro harness cycled down from combat burn to standard output. Highfather, watching from the new Genesis command vessel, closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them and looked at the coordinates where the aperture had been with the expression of a man who has seen the end of something that deserved to end. Clark came back to the Yamato at reduced velocity, which was its own kind of statement about what the 47 minutes had cost. He was intact. Kryptonian biology and yellow sun energy saw to that. But there was a quality to his return that the Yamato's crew recognized. From their own experience, the specific quality of someone who has been at the absolute limit of what they can sustain and has come back from it carrying the knowledge of how close the limit actually was. He phased through the observation port rather than using the airlock, because the extra 90 seconds mattered less than sitting down, and he sat down on the deck of the corridor just inside the port, with his back against the bulkhead and his eyes closed for approximately 45 seconds. Yuki Mori brought him water. He accepted it without comment, which was more honest than any words he could have offered about The last 47 minutes. And she stood beside him in the specific silence of someone who understands that presence is the appropriate response to this kind of exhaustion, not speech. Bruce came through from the sensor station. He looked at Clark for a moment, and then sat down across from him on the deck. With the particular economy of motion, that meant he had also been running at capacity for an extended period and was making a pragmatic decision about energy allocation. He had his data pad, because Bruce always had his data pad, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Clark. Casualties, Clark said. It wasn't a question. 17 lanterns with ring failures requiring medical attention. 3 serious. None fatal. Bruce paused. Orion took damage to the astro harness. He's functional. Angry about the harness. Another pause. New Genesis lost 2 Celestials. Highfather has been informed. Clark was quiet for a moment. The fleet. Gone, Bruce said. The aperture closure trapped the transit formation between dimensions. During the final push, the own instruments are reading the dimensional space between the aperture coordinates as stable, permanently. He looked at the data pad. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they're not coming back through that specific door. There are other doors, Clark said. There are always other doors, Bruce agreed. But not today. Kodai found them there, 2 of the most powerful and prepared people in this universe sitting on the floor of a corridor in a damaged ship. Because sometimes the floor is where you end up, and pretending otherwise is a waste of energy that could be spent on something useful. He looked at them both and sat down himself, completing a triangle. And for a moment the 3 of them simply occupied the same space without requiring anything from each other, which was its own kind of alliance. It's over, Kodai said, meaning the immediate threat, meaning this particular iteration of the thing that had been hunting his ship. For now, Bruce said, which was not pessimism but accuracy. And Kodai recognized the distinction because he had been living inside it for his entire career. The gun, Kodai said. Tokugawa says the barrel housing can be repaired, Bruce said. The structural cuts were precise. The induction points are compromised, but the underlying architecture is intact. With the right materials and sufficient time. How long? Kodai said. Bruce looked at his data pad. Given access to new Genesis fabrication technology, which Highfather has already offered, and assuming Tokugawa's team works without major interruption. He paused. 18 months. Possibly less. Kodai nodded slowly. 18 months in a universe that ran on different rules, with a ship that needed repair, and a crew that needed rest, and a home that might or might not still exist, on the other side of a dimensional breach that had permanently sealed itself. He took the measure of that and did not look away from it. The aperture, he said. Our way home. Closed, Bruce said. The dimensional geometry is stable now, the breach is gone. But he paused, and the pause had the quality of something he had been working on for the last several hours and had arrived at a conclusion about that he was choosing to present carefully. The wave motion discharge that brought you here, the resonance that created the original aperture. We have the full spectral data from the own instruments, the precise frequency, the dimensional coordinates of your universe's location, relative to this one. He looked at Kodai, with sufficient time and the right technology, new Genesis. Boom tube engineering, modified for dimensional transit rather than spatial. It may be possible to open a controlled aperture on the same coordinates. Kodai looked at him with the eyes of a man who has learned not to reach for things until he has confirmed they are actually there. Maybe possible. Maybe, Bruce confirmed. I won't tell you it's certain, but I won't tell you it's impossible, because the data suggests otherwise, and I don't say things I can't support. He held Kodai's gaze. You have a way home. It requires time and work and cooperation from people in this universe who have very good reasons to provide it. He paused. You also have, in the meantime, a universe that knows what you are and what your ship can do, and what it cost you to do it. Clark opened his eyes. He looked at Kodai in the specific way he looked at people when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for long enough that it had weight. The Justice League has a protocol for situations like this, he said. Crew and vessel requiring temporary shelter while dimensional transit is being arranged. It hasn't been used for a ship this size before. It hasn't been used for a crew from a completely different universe before. He paused. But the protocol exists because we knew, eventually, someone would need it. Kodai looked at him steadily. You're offering us sanctuary. I'm offering you time, Clark said. To rest. To repair. To find your way home without being asked to fight for it first. He paused. The fighting was yours. The time is ours to give. Kodai was quiet for a long moment. Through the observation port at the end of the corridor, the stars were visible, different stars, arranged in patterns that no Yamato crew member would ever fully recognize as home. Burning in a universe that operated on principles there. Instruments were still learning to read. He looked at them the way sailors look at unfamiliar stars, with the specific combination of disorientation and determination that has been the navigator's fundamental condition since the first vessel left the first shore for unknown water. My crew, he said. Their well-being is the condition. Understood, Clark said. And we are not a weapon, Kodai said. Not for the Justice League, not for the Guardians, not for anyone. When the gun is repaired, it belongs to the Yamato. The Yamato answers to Earth. Our Earth. Understood, Clark said again. Then yes, Kodai said. Sanctuary. While we find our way home. He stood, and Clark stood, and Bruce stood, and in the Yamato's engineering bay. Tokugawa's team was already assessing the barrel, housing repairs with the focused attention of people who have been given a problem and a timeline and have decided that both of those things are acceptable challenges. In the medical bay, the wounded were healing. In the crew quarters, the exhausted were sleeping. The analyzer was running continuous diagnostics and reporting them to no one in particular with the dedicated efficiency of a machine that had decided that thoroughness was its own reward. The Yamato held its position at the edge of OA, its hull fractured and its flag still flying and its wave motion, engine pulsing at low power, a heartbeat in the dark that the emotional spectrum had no category for and had stopped trying to find one. Across the sector, Hal Jordan filed his after-action report with the specific fatigue of someone who has done something significant and is required to document it in standard core format, which was designed for situations considerably less unusual than this one. He noted the dimensional origin of the vessel. He noted the crew complement and their status. He noted the wave motion, gun's current non-operational state, and Tokugawa's repair timeline. He noted Superman's involvement and Batman's tactical coordination, and Orion's combat performance and Highfather's deployment. He noted the aperture's permanent closure and the dimensional coordinates Bruce had extracted from the own data. In the field-marked threat classification, he typed, resolved, immediate, ongoing, long-term. See attached. In the field-marked additional notes, he typed, the ship is called the Yamato. The crew are human. They came from somewhere else, and they held the line anyway. I think that's worth noting. He submitted the report and looked out at the stars and thought about a damaged ship and a captain who had kept his hand 6 inches from a trigger for 4 minutes and 11 seconds and had not moved it, and thought that in a universe full of people who could bench press mountains and rewrite physics with a ring and reshape matter with a thought, that particular 4 minutes and 11 seconds was one of the braver things he had seen. His ring pulsed green in the dark, somewhere beyond the sealed aperture coordinates. In the dimensional space between this universe and the one the Yamato called home, the wave motion resonance frequency that Bruce had extracted from the own data sat in the League's database like a set of coordinates, written on the inside of a locked door, waiting for the key that knew Genesis, engineering, and sufficient time and the specific human stubbornness that had kept a battleship flying across dimensions might eventually provide. And in the throne room of Apocalypse, Darkseid sat with his hands on the arms of his throne and looked at the intelligence reports from the sector with the particular stillness of someone who has watched a situation develop in a direction he did not control and is now revising his understanding of what the Yamato represents, what its captain is capable of, and what it means that a ship from outside this universe arrived in it and chose, at the moment of maximum pressure, not to become a weapon. He found that interesting. He found it interesting in the way that Darkseid found most things interesting, which was the way of very large and very patient Find something that might eventually be useful, interesting. With the cold, cosmic patience of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. Since before the universe learned to count, the Yamato's engine pulsed. The stars burned. The line had been held. In the end, the space battleship, Yamato, did what it had always done. It survived something that should have been unsurvivable, and the surviving changed things. In a universe of gods and dark nights and cosmic abstracts, it had arrived as a weapon and remained a ship. Its crew had been offered the chance to end one extinction by enabling another and had kept their hands 6 inches from the trigger. The wave motion gun was silent, the aperture was sealed, and somewhere in the league's database a set of dimensional coordinates waited like a promise, imprecise, unguaranteed, but present. Kodai had not asked for sanctuary easily, and Clark had not offered it lightly, and Bruce had already begun building the contingency plan that neither of them knew about yet, because that was what Bruce did, and because a ship that could permanently collapse the emotional spectrum was exactly the kind of thing that required a contingency plan regardless of how much he respected its captain. The Yamato rested at the edge of OA under alien stars, its hull bearing the evidence of everything it had endured, its flag still mounted at the stern. Whatever came next, and something always came next, it would face it as it had faced everything else. Together, and moving forward, and not yet done.